Shalom and welcome everyone to Messianic Delaware. My name is Jerry Mitchell, and I want to thank you so much for joining today as we study through the language, the culture, and the history to find the truth that is revealed in the words of our Creator. Today, something that took a little bit of a twist as I was going through it. A few months ago, I delivered a message to a group other than Messianic Delaware. And you could have titled it Everybody Knows That, because I used that as a recurring theme through my presentation. And as I was going through some things, I related some things that have been told to me that really it seems like things ought to be true but might not be. Okay? So today, as we go through this, you got to stick with me. I'm going to go quick. I got a lot of ground to cover, and I'm going to try and get through this as quickly as possible, but as thoroughly as possible at the same time. When I was a young child, okay, I remember, and I still to this day, every time I smell a certain smell that reminds me of the church I was in. I was handed this little coloring page, and it had three angels on it, and all these three angels had wings. They were all female, and I looked at my mother, who happened to be the Sunday school teacher, and another lady who was a little older than my mother at the time, and I asked the question, do all angels have wings? Well, both adults in the room looked up and said, well, of course, everybody knows that. And that sort of started this journey that brought me to today. And as we go through this, you'll see hopefully what I mean by everybody knows that. There are certain truths that we accept that might not fit what's in the Bible. So as we go through this, let's take a look and see what is an angel. Well, if we look in Genesis 16:7, it's the first time we see the word actually angel, and the Hebrew word molach is from Strong's 4397, and it's a messenger. In other words, the word angel in Hebrew is a job description. Okay, it is someone who delivers a message. So when we talk about the angel guarding the garden, like in Genesis 3:24, it wasn't really an angel. It was what's known as a cherubim. It's one of the divine beings. Its number, Strong's number 3742, and the description there is probably an order of angelic beings. So see, this word angel has evolved to include divine beings. But that's not technically what it is. And we need to be very specific when we're talking about these things, because the Bible is very specific when it talks about these things. Now, Exodus 25:20, we see the cherubims, actually an Englishized word for the plural of cherubim. It says, shall stretch forth their wings on high, covering the mercy seat with their wings, and their faces shall look to one another towards the mercy seat, shall the faces of the cherubim be. Now, here is a picture of what the mercy seat actually looks like. We see a lot of times where they're sitting on top of the mercy seat with their wings stretched across. What the mercy seat actually is, and what the Ark of the Covenant actually is the throne of God on earth. It represents the throne of God on earth. Now, you know, Ezekiel saw the wheel. Here we see these other cherubim divine beings holding up a throne, and it seems to be round, but they're holding it on the corners, and they move in unison. Okay. But here in this particular picture, we actually see two, one on either side, standing with one wing stretched across, the other touching to make the back of the seat, or the back of the throne. The mercy seat would be the seat of the throne. And this is an actual, probably the best picture that I was able to find of what the mercy seat would be. And these divine beings facing each other, because they would be looking towards the Almighty as he would sit on the seat, right? Now, oftentimes we see other descriptions of these what we commonly call cherubim. The cherubs probably, if we had to describe one single cherub, it's not going to be that little baby-faced angelic being thing that we normally think of when we think of cherubs, right? Here is a very good description, or actually it's an artist's rendition of one. Here you see he has two arms. His legs look like those of a cloved hoofed animal. He has four sets of wings, two in which this particular one has four sets of wings. Some we know have six sets, some we know have two, but it just depends on. They're all cherubs, but they're probably different orders of cherubs. There are actually people who study angels that know all these technical terms for this. I'm not one of those people, obviously. But here we see this artist rendition of a cherub. The head, you can see, if it would look one way, it would look like one thing. If it turned its head, it would look like something else. I think that this is probably a very good representation of what one of these divine beings we know as cherubs would be. Now, from cherubs, we also know of seraphs, right? Seraphim. There are songs out there that talk about the cherubim and the seraphim. Well, what's a seraphim? Seraphim comes from translates to Strong's number 8314. And it's probably the most familiar out of Isaiah chapter 6, verse 2. Above it stood the seraphim. Each one had 6 wings. 2 covered his face, 2 covered his feet, and with 2 he was flying. Okay? Now, that gives, and we know about if you continue reading in Isaiah, you're going to get this whole idea where he takes this hot coal and puts it on his lips, and you can read that story. I'm giving you the Cliff Notes version. That's the very short version because I got a lot of ground to cover here. I encourage you to go read that because it's important when we compare this to the not so familiar seraphs found in Numbers 21:6. And Jehovah sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and much people of Israel died. That word fiery serpents, if you go back and you look at it in Hebrew, are seraphim. The seraphim that we think of in Isaiah, we think of these angelic beings. But it's the same Hebrew word that we see in Numbers chapter 21. Now, I happen to have found a, for lack of a better term, a carved relief or an icon from the ancient world, and it is seen here with a drawing beside it. Okay, and this is what a seraph would have looked like. I did actually blow up the part on the right, and this is what you see. Now, I am not going to be able to translate what's underneath of that for a couple of reasons. One is, if you translate it out, it doesn't make sense. So what I am thinking, and I may be wrong, okay, so my speculation warning's out here. This is an anagram, not an anagram, acronym. So each letter would represent a word. All right, so as you think about what it might represent, and for you Hebrew scholars out there, you can try this. You can go out there. It is the older Paleo. You can go back there and you can see what words might fit this description of what we see as an apparent cobra, okay, with wings. And it apparently, it does, if you look at it closely, appear to have 2 sets of large wings and 1 set of smaller wings, so that gives it 6 wings, and it matches perfectly what we see described in the Bible. You see, these things that are described in Scripture are often, when we go back to the ancient world, we can find drawings, we can find carvings, we can find etchings. We can see these things that were carved in stone. So people had this idea. They carved out or they etched in stone what they saw. Don't think that this is just some kind of a freaky myth, because it's not a myth. What you read in the Bible is real. The things are here for a reason. If we think about this and these seraphim, when you go back into the Numbers section, you know, when God sent these things, because the people were, and I encourage you to go back and read Numbers 21 and see the lesson about this. The people were distraught. They were complaining again. And God said, you know what, I'm sick of it. And he sent these creatures, and he told Moses, he says, look, you make two representations of this. Now, this could go into a whole nother lesson, all right? But I'm not going to go there. He says, you represent something man-made, you put it up on a pole, and when the people are bitten by one of these things, if they'll look towards that, they'll be healed. That's a lesson that stretches from Numbers through Revelation, and I don't have time to go through that. It would probably take me about 2 or 3 days to really be able to teach that so that you could understand it. But like I said, I don't have time for that right now. Let's continue. If we look at Hebrews 13:2, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for in doing so some have entertained angels without knowing it. I would venture to guess, if you did something for somebody you didn't know, and they looked like that artist's representation of a cherub, or they looked like that etching of a seraph, you would have remembered that. You would actually know that you have done something for somebody that looked like that, right? But in Hebrews, the writer says, you entertain angels without knowing it. That gives us this idea that angels don't really have a defined appearance that makes them special. In other words, they look like people, right? Let's look at Genesis 28:12. This is Jacob's ladder dream. It says, and he dreamed and beheld a ladder set up on the earth. The top of it reached the heavens. And behold, the angels of God ascending and descending. In other words, they were going up and down this ladder. There was nothing about them that said they could fly. There's nothing about them that, although there's places where Scripture says angels do fly without wings. So, you know, we see this imagery of people going up and down, in and out of heaven. Here's a better example of that. Joshua 5:13 through 15. Now it came to pass when Joshua was near Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there was a man, and if you look in Hebrew, it does say Aish, a man, standing in front of him, and his sword drawn in his hand. Joshua approached him and said, are you for us or for our adversaries? Neither, he said. Rather, I have come as commander of Jehovah's army. Then Joshua fell on the ground and worshipped. He asked him, what is my Lord saying to his servant? Then the commander of Jehovah's army replied to Joshua, take your sandals off your foot, take your sandals off your foot, for the place you're standing is holy. And Joshua did so. If this would have been a cherub, if this would have been a seraph, he would not have looked like a man standing there. It would have been a different description. The Bible is very specific on these things, especially when you go back to the original language. It's extremely specific. So specific sometimes that it's very hard, if you're going to interject something, you can't always go back, and we'll see this later, you can't always go back and correct every place where you need to correct it if you're going to add something later. Okay. So now we have these things called angels, we have these things called cherubs, we have these things called seraphs. So maybe a better question to ask is, do angels have wings? Not do all angels have wings, but do angels have wings? The answer to that question would be no. We know that cherubim and seraphim have wings, and there may be other divine beings that are not named. They may have wings, But biblically speaking, and I need to be very specific here, biblically speaking, angels do not have wings. Hopefully the question you're asking is, why is this important? Why should we bother to know and understand these things about angels? Doesn't everybody know? Well, no, they don't. Because when we understand these things from a biblical perspective, we can better answer the questions that other people ask. Now, it is possible that some people recognize there's confusion about these things, and we should be prepared to offer an answer. You know, that's what Peter wrote. Be prepared to offer an answer for the hope we have of our salvation. Because if people begin to see these conflicts in Scripture, then what they're going to do is they're going to use that conflict and they're going to try and drive a wedge between your faith and your God. All right? And here is the next place where that happens. Were Cain and Abel the first children born to Adam and Eve? Well, of course they were. Everybody knows that, right? Everybody knows that. You can read it. You can see it. It's evident. Everybody knows that Cain and Abel were the first sons of Adam and Eve. Really? Let's dig. Let's dig into this and see if we can figure this out. Now, I'll tell you, this argument's been going on for a very long time, but I'm going to present you the evidence and why it's important. Okay? Because of the subject here, everybody knows that. Something everybody accepts. Let's look at the actual evidence and see why everybody accepts it. Genesis 4:1. Adam knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. Now, you can read through Genesis 4, and I encourage you to do that. And as you do, you're going to see where Cain kills Abel. And then God speaks to Cain, and they have this conversation. The transcript is there in Genesis chapter 4. Finally, Cain says, well, you've driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from the face, and from your face I will be hidden, and I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond on the earth. And it shall come to pass that everyone that finds me shall slay me. Hopefully the obvious question you may have never asked before is, who is the everyone? If Cain and Abel were the two oldest, okay, no one else is mentioned here in this first 14 verses. Who's the everyone? Who is the everyone? Now, this verse seems to be in conflict with Genesis 4:25. You read down just a little further, and it says, Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son and called his name Seth. For God, she said, has anointed me another seed of Abel, whom Cain slew. This is very confusing in English, and this verse even seems to be in conflict with, are you ready for this? Genesis 5:1-3. This is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day that God created man, in the likeness of God made he him. Male and female created he them, and blessed them, and called their name Adam in the day when they were created. And Adam lived 130 years, and begat a son in his own likeness, after his image, and called his name Seth. Wait a minute. These are the generations of Adam, and it begins with Seth, not Cain, not Abel. And it's also in conflict with 1 Chronicles 1:1, which begins Adam, Seth, and Enosh. Okay? Now, there are books in the Pseudepigrapha, and if you don't know what the Pseudepigrapha is, it includes the Apocrypha and a bunch of other writings, some which are credible, some which are not. There are books that refer to this. However, the books that actually refer to Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel that I have been able to research, okay, which means they are translated into English, we have a problem with them. They are not reliable for various reasons. One of the books I was reading, it actually had Eve returning to the garden, okay? She was after some sweet fragrance for Adam, and she goes back to the garden, and it names an angel now who is standing at the gate of the Garden of Eden as Gabriel. That's entirely impossible. Gabriel is a messenger. He's an angel. We know absolutely because in, excuse me, in chapter 3 of Genesis, it specifically names a cherub, or an unnamed cherub, just a divine being, standing to guard the gate. Gabriel's a messenger. He's not a cherub. He's a different type of divine being. That in itself excludes, let me repeat that excludes the reliability of that particular book in this situation, because it's a fatal flaw. Fatal flaws, remember, if you are doing something and you include a mistake in the equation, that's a fatal flaw. This will be considered a mistake in the equation because it names Gabriel as the guard of the garden. Gabriel's not the guard of the garden. Okay, so how do we make sense of this? Well, one possibility is that the text was manipulated after Moses finished it. Okay, and that happens. There's other places in the Torah where many people consider additions were made. Okay, the end of Deuteronomy is a good example. There are places there where it more matches something that Isaiah or Jeremiah would have written than Moses. There are people who really think that that may have been inserted at the end of Deuteronomy to give it more credibility, because Moses would have written it, it receives more credibility. Whether that happened or not, my opinion's still out on that. I don't think so, because if you look back into it, we see Moses writes different accounts the same way, and some of these accounts where he's writing prophetically is written different than the accounts he's writing historically. Okay? And I hope that makes sense. That the things he's talking about in the past, he talks about differently than the things he's talking about in the future, and we know that it's him writing this because of the way it's written. Let's continue with this. Probably a better explanation for this is the combination of ancient Hebrew storytelling. Remember, not everybody knew how to read and write. So the ones who could read would read Moses' accounts, and they would tell them, and other people would continue telling the story and telling the story and telling the story, and then they'd go back and compare their storytelling to what was written, and they would tell the story and tell the story and tell the story. So ancient Hebrew storytelling and the way their sentence syntax evolved over many years. Now let's add that and combine that with the enemy's desire to confuse the truth. Okay? That could have contributed to the conflicting verses we see today about the account of Cain and Abel, Adam and Eve, who's first, who's not first, and who the everybody else is. Okay? Like I said, this argument has been going on for a very, very, very long time. My personal feeling, and here's my speculation interjection, okay, is that because we see later writers putting Seth as the firstborn, chances are very, very good that Seth was the firstborn. And the story of Cain and Abel is placed in Genesis chapter 4 because of the content of that lesson. Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden because of sin. Sin continues with Cain and Abel, the first murder. The everybody else was one of those things that the writer simply forgot to go back and take out because they added something in a later verse. So what we have now is Seth was first. We know Adam and Eve had many, many children, many, many, many children over the 800-year span of their childbearing years. So now what we see, okay, is later down the line somewhere we have Cain and Abel who have their conflict. Now Abel goes, he may have already been married when he killed Abel. All right? Cain may have already been married when he killed Abel. So why is this important? What makes this particular seemingly conflicting story important? Have you ever heard of something called the Scopes monkey trial? Hopefully you have, and if you're listening to this, chances are great that you have. The Scopes monkey trial technically is named the State of Tennessee versus John Thomas Scopes. Okay? John Thomas Scopes was a substitute teacher, and he was accused of violating the Butler Act. In other words, he was accused of teaching human evolution in the state of Tennessee. The two major lawyers in this case were William Jennings Bryan, which you may have heard that name before. He ran for president a couple times and lost, and Clarence Darrow. Now, the interesting thing is, although Scopes was found guilty, they said, yes, you did this. Okay? He taught human evolution. He violated the Butler Act. Creation lost in the court of public opinion. Let me say that again. Creation lost in the court of public opinion. I want to make that clear. Creation lost in the court of public opinion. Why? Because the testimony of William Jennings Bryan centered on Cain's wife. Believe it or not, where Cain got his wife made all the difference to public opinion. Bryan was interrupted by Darrow when he said, I didn't try to find, and then his testimony right there in the transcript stops, and Darrow interrupts and says, what do you mean you didn't try to find? Had Bryan been able to interject Cain's statement of everybody who finds me will try to kill me, and had he been able to explain it properly, I think, and this is my opinion, it would have changed the public's opinion and possibly the entire evolution agenda. I think if William Jennings Bryan had been able to better understand, better comprehend, and had been really a student of Scripture when he was on that stand and testifying, he would have known what to say. But instead, he trusted his own ways. He trusted himself. He leaned on his own understanding. Okay? And his own understanding failed. And that failure led to the court of public opinion back in near the turn of the 20th century, or 19th century into the 20th century, and it gave evolution the foothold that it needed to really jump and be, maybe I should say, become part of the public's failure, for lack of a better word. They failed. Unfortunately, there was not a preacher, there was not anyone out there at the time willing to jump up and say, wait, stop, this isn't right. He messed up. No, there's no record of anybody trying to do that. The church, had they actually studied Scripture and known what was going on and presented these things and done it in such a way, I think that the general public's opinion would be much different today than what it is. Okay? Everybody knows that is a declaration of assertion. And people use it when they don't know the answer to a question or when they don't want the truth to be revealed. You know, when a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old asks about the tooth fairy, well, of course it's real. Everybody knows that. Is Santa Claus real? Of course he's real. Everybody knows that. Well, why are we lying to our children? Why are we lying to each other, and why are we lying to ourselves? Our traditions, the legends, and our dominational doctrines have contributed not only to the hypocrisy of the church, it has contributed to the demonization of Christians and Jews alike, because the secular world and the public opinion looks at people who testify like William Jennings Bryan, and they say, you don't know what you're talking about. They look at the people who set bombs off in front of abortion clinics, to purposely harm the people who work there. And they say, you're a hypocrite. You want to protect one life, but you're willing to sacrifice another. You're hypocrites. You're demons. That's what you're portraying when you do those things. We must be ready to answer our critics, and we must be just as willing to correct our fellow believers. Okay? Now, some of these things, like I say, especially, the oldest child of Adam and Eve, I don't really honestly believe that we have enough information given to us that we can stand on any one rock and say, this is it. I do lean towards Seth being the oldest because of the clues that we see. But in a court, that would all be circumstantial evidence. I don't have a smoking gun. I don't have the testimony of a witness other than Moses and the writer of Chronicles. Okay? Those are the only two witnesses that I can point to. But I have other witnesses. Whether they are reliable or not, I don't know. It's in conflict. Well, it's not really in conflict, but it is confusing. Okay? That's why it's important. And sometimes it is better to say, here is a situation that we really can't resolve, but here's the information. You choose. What do you think? Rather than to become hypocritical and say, well, Cain's wife isn't my concern, which is another portion of the testimony of Bryan. I don't worry about her, is what he said. That's why it's important. No matter how many people want to believe a lie, man cannot change the truth of our Creator. We just can't do it. What God says, God says. What God plants, God plants. And it's not that everybody knows that, but it's everybody should learn that. And when we learn that, then we have a rock to stand on. If you're willing to stand on Scripture the way it's written, and don't be afraid of these hard questions. Don't be afraid of the tough stuff. I've always said I'm not afraid of the hard questions. I know which way I lean on this, and I lean that Seth is the oldest when it comes to Adam and Eve. I lean that angels don't have wings. There are divine beings with wings. There are divine beings without wings, obviously. But the thing is, we have to be able to explain that to people who don't understand it or don't want to believe it in such a way that we can make them question their let me rephrase that. We need to make them question the lie that they believe. See, if they're believing a certain way, if they believe 2 + 2 is 5, We need to make them question their belief. And when we can convince them, when we can, just like Satan did to Eve, did God really say that? Is 2 plus 2 really 5? Come back to the truth. All Eve had to do was say, he told us not to touch it. Or he told us not to eat it. Instead, she said, he told us not to touch it. We shouldn't even touch it. Doesn't matter if she touched it or not. You don't eat it. You could collect it. You could put it in a basket, set it back into the tree. It's fine. It'll stay there. Just don't eat it. Is 2 plus 2 5? Really? Really? Well, of course it is. Everybody knows that. Really? How about that? These things are important. There's a couple of books written. One is, I can't remember the exact name of it, but it talks about the obvious conflicts in the Bible. Well, the only obvious conflicts in the Bible are the ones that we create for ourselves. These, what I'm talking about, especially with Cain and Abel and Seth, they're not apparent conflicts. There's confusion there because of the amount of information we have. But when we dig through the language, we dig through the culture, and we dig through the history, we can look at the clues, and we have enough clues, in my opinion, to make an intelligent decision. And we look at it and we say, here's what makes the most sense. It may have been written 3,800 years ago, but here's what makes the most sense. Well, maybe 3,400 years ago now. Here's what makes the most sense. So, as we look at these things, don't be afraid of the hard questions. Don't skip over it and say, oh, it's just too hard, we'll never understand it. Dig. Don't be afraid of the language. Don't be afraid of the culture. Don't be afraid of the history. Don't be afraid to stand on the word of your Creator. Everybody should learn that. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope this has been a blessing to you. I didn't want to confuse you. I know I talked really fast, but if I'd have explained all of this, we'd be here for the next couple of days. Have a wonderful, wonderful week, and I really, really encourage you to go back and look at the verses that I have mentioned here. Study them, and you decide for yourself. Have a great, great week.